So here we are. Thank you. Welcome, everybody. Welcome, you all out there, to this first virtual Brussels Playbook interview. My name is Florian Eder. I'm the author of our Brussels Playbook morning email from Politico here in Brussels. And with me today are my colleague Marion Soleti, who directs the expert policy coverage of our newsroom as managing editor for Pro. And of course, our guest, Thomas Piketty. Welcome very much. It's a great pleasure to have you here, who is, of course, as you all know, a professor of economics at the Paris School of Economics, a columnist over at the colleagues of Le Monde, where he's got his own blog, and a best-selling author of books on the economy. And one of them is literally, virtually, the basis for our conversation here, as it is directly under my computer. To elevate it a little bit, there is Capital and Ideology. So thank you, everybody here, to this event. It's the first event that we do. It's an adaptation of what we usually do on a stage, a live interview, one-on-one, with an interesting guest where we talk about topical things. So we brought that into the online space and online sphere. It's my great pleasure to have you all here. So welcome, everybody out there on Zoom and other platforms. On a short housekeeping note, I want to encourage you to ask questions, but please only using the Q&A tool in Zoom. And of course, you are very much encouraged to tweet using the hashtag Politico Piketty, and the handle events at Politico is the one where our colleagues will tweet about this. So welcome again, welcome Marion, welcome Thomas Piketty. And let me kick this off with a first question to you, of course, as we are in the middle of a huge economic crisis and a healthcare crisis here in Europe in the Corona crisis. What do you think 5 years from now? Will we remember the spring of 2020 as a healthcare crisis or a very deep economic crisis?
It's really too early to say. Let me simply say that, of course, we've never seen something like this. We've never seen the decision to lock down everybody, the economy, around the world in such a manner. We've seen epidemic crises. The Spanish flu of 1918, 1919 is the closest comparison point that comes to mind. But from this experience, what we also know is that it's too early to say, in the sense that one of the most frightening episode and evolution in the case of the Spanish flu was that the final casualties, were a lot higher than what one might have thought in the first few weeks or months, and in particular, they ended up being, much larger in poor countries than in rich countries, and with death rate going up to 5% in India, in Indonesia with the Spanish flu. Now, of course, this doesn't mean much about today, because this is a very different epidemic, this is a different world, so nobody knows really. But this is just to say, how much, what we will remember of this crisis, is really very much depends on how the epidemic is going to unfold, in not only in European countries where it has started to become really big over the past 6 weeks, but also in the US. Is it going to be in the end bigger in the US than in Europe in terms of casualties per inhabitant? Nobody knows at this stage. Is it going to catch? Is it going to catch in poor and developing countries, where there's a big need to develop, a more robust social state and health infrastructure and safety net? And is the crisis going to lead to this kind of evolution in case things get really bad? At this stage, we really, we really don't know.
We really don't know, and yet politicians are starting to look for ways out of this crisis, while as you say, there is still a huge number of unknowns. We don't know how deep the crisis is going to be. We don't know how bad the healthcare thing is going to be. But of course, already there are calls for an economic recovery program, and there was an EU leaders meeting, virtual video conference meeting last week, where they decided not about the size really yet, and not about the exact modalities, but about the fact that there is going to be a recovery fund. Now it looks as if this recovery fund will be filled with a lot of money. what is your expectation? Should there be joint debt issuance also, as some countries call for, or is that again one of these things that's too early to say?
Well, no, this of course we can discuss. What's too early to say is, what are going to be the final casualties of the epidemics? How is it going to develop in the different parts of the world? That's too early to say. What we already know. Let me start by saying that this crisis illustrates the violence of inequality. We can see between rich and poor countries potentially, but also within rich country, within France, within Europe, the lockdown doesn't mean at all the same thing. If you're in a big apartment, if you're in a very small house, or if you are homeless, it doesn't mean at all the same thing. If you have good unemployment benefit to cover your income loss, or if you don't. And what we realize, I think we've not done enough to begin with, in order to develop, income maintenance mechanism that would apply not only to the regular full-time permanent wage earners, but also to a large group of workers which have grown over time in European economies, which are self-employed, self-entrepreneur, temporary workers, Uber-type delivery workers, all sorts of part-time jobs, which I can see in the streets of Paris, are doing delivery work on their bicycle because they don't have proper income maintenance so far, or even people who are regular wage earners but who were on a temporary contract and whose temporary contract ended a bit before or a bit after the beginning of the lockdown. They don't have the proper income support system. So this creates huge inequality, and this is also bad, of course, for the whether we're going to keep, we're going to limit the magnitude of the crisis and the lowering of GDP this year. Now, so there will be a lot to say about how we can improve our welfare state, our system of social transfer, which is not sufficiently universal, not sufficiently automatic, efficient. There are things to learn from different European countries, but we all have to improve what we have. So here there's a big topic. Now, in terms of macroeconomic, and I take your question was very much on the sort of budget and public debt. Let me simply say, generally speaking, that the Eurozone and the European Union more generally, but in particular the Economic and Monetary Union, is still very fragile in its foundation, and for a number of reasons. The first general reason is that I don't think in the long term you can have a common currency without common budget, or at least some elements of a common tax system, and you cannot have a single currency with 19 different interest rate, in which markets can speculate all the time. And as long as financial markets will be able to wonder, which country is going to fall, which country is going, how is the spread between Italy or Spain and Germany and France going to change in the next 6 months, in the next 2 years, in the next 3 years, our monetary union will be a very fragile construction. You cannot, if you go for a common currency, which means that you lose the possibility, of using, for instance, a devaluation in order to boost your economy after the crisis. So once you lose this monetary sovereignty, you need to gain in exchange, something else, and in particular, you need to gain in exchange some stability on your interest rate, and basically you need to mutualize the interest rate. And I think that's really very important, and we need to talk a lot more about that. The second problem, structural problem with the Eurozone and the European Union that we have is that the rule of unanimity for all budgetary matters is something that just doesn't work and will not work. And the only reason why the European Central Bank has been able to do something over the past 10 years, since the 2008 financial crisis, that of course it's not subject to the rule of unanimity, the simple majority rule, but you cannot ask everything from a central bank. So we have a complete asymmetry, in our governance system in Europe. So I mean, you all know that, everybody knows that, but this is something we should not get accustomed to. So what's the way out? Well, as we know, we are not going to have unanimity in order to get rid of unanimity. We've been pretending for a long time that we will have this, but of course we know that this won't happen. So the only solution is that a subgroup of countries develop separate decision-making mechanism through majority, through also more transparent and open decision-making. The fact that we still have today, this Eurozone meeting or meeting of head of state, which meet behind closed doors, that nobody knows the arguments that are being exchanged publicly. I know people in Brussels are accustomed to this and think that this is the only way to organize things, but this is a disaster. This is exactly what makes everybody hate Europe, and this will have to change. And I can bet that those who believe that the current institution are in a steady state and that nothing will ever change, at the end will turn to be wrong. I bet you, if we look at the institution in 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, I don't know exactly how they will look like, but they will be very different from what we have today. Because what we have today is a very fragile setting, which can, this can lead to terrible discussion. So, but I think there are ways out. So, we can come back on the issue of mutualizing the interest rate. We can come back on different specific proposal. But let me finish this first, response by saying that, there are ways out. It's possible for 2 or 3 or 4 countries, to make proposal to develop. Just let me give you one example. As you all know, Germany and France signed a new bilateral treaty last year about the renewing the old bilateral France-Germany treaty that was set up by De Gaulle and Adenauer a long time ago. And this new French-German bilateral treaty decided to set up a French-German parliamentary assembly made up of about 50 members from the German
parliament,
the French Assemblée Nationale. They met in Strasbourg. As you know, there's a parliament in Strasbourg which is not being used as much as it could, so that's good. So they met in Strasbourg last time in February. Schäuble was giving the big speech to begin with. There was some request by parliament members from Die Linke and the equivalent in France that we talk more about tax harmonization in this setup. They were told that this was not the topic of the day. Look, I think this is a very interesting development because, the only problem with this parliamentary assembly, of course, is that the treaty did not give them any real power. It's purely consultative. They talk about very important issues, including corporate law, defense policies, a number of important issues, but it's purely consultative. But what we've learned, at least for those who didn't know, is that it's perfectly possible for 2 countries or 3 or 4 countries, it could be France with Italy and Spain, to create Corona bonds, for instance, to create some separate decision-making body, separate from the current European Union institution, without breaking with the European Union. So I think it's
that is a call for actually that Corona bonds in a smaller group. There has been this has been discussed over the past weeks, more behind closed doors again, because some would see it as dangerous actually, and as an invitation to speculate, to markets to speculate against the unity of the Eurozone. But you, by what you just said, you would advocate that this is actually a good idea, that it's worth following up and thinking about. That some countries, bring their financial force together and go to the markets and say, lend us money, we're guaranteeing for each other.
Yeah, so let me return to that. Yeah, I think it's necessary to mutualize the interest rate with as many countries from the Eurozone as possible. So it will be better, of course, to have all countries. It will also be better to have all EU countries in the Eurozone. It would also be better to have Britain back. It's always better to be more numerous, but it's better to start with 2 rather countries rather than 1, 3 rather than 2, 4 rather than 3. I think it's important to make clear that what we are talking about here, in my view, is to mutualize the interest rate, not to repay the debt of other countries. And this is very different. And I think it's very important to be clear about that, because you have some politicians, in particular in the Netherlands, but also in Germany, who try to pretend that this is an issue about repaying the debt of others, whereas this is an issue about mutualizing the interest rate. The fact that you cannot say, okay, we are on the good side of the financial market, the financial markets are more confident in us, therefore we have a lower interest rate than you, and this is fair because this is market discipline. I think you cannot organize a large political and economic community like the Eurozone or the European Union simply on the basis of market discipline and market prices, because these market prices are very noisy signals, which I think don't allow you to otherwise you put yourself in the end of financial markets, because this can go anywhere. You end up with the European Central Bank actually gradually taking control of a larger fraction of the public debt, because this is the only way to avoid complete financial panic about the spread. That cannot be the right solution in the long run. I think if in the United States, the Federal Reserve Bank every morning had to choose between the interest rate of California and the interest rate of Louisiana and the interest rate of New York, it will be a big mess. And this is the reason why it took us so much time to recover after the 2008 financial crisis. We provoked a new recession, as you know, in 2011, 2012 for stupid reason, because we were afraid of democratic decision making about budget deficit. So we had this very automatic budget rule, which in the end pushed us into a new recession in 2011, 12, 13, at the time when the US were already recovering. And this uncertainty about the interest rate of different countries, and more generally the uncertainty about whether we want to stay together or not, is really what fragilizes us. And in the end, this is bad for everybody, including for the people who have pension funds in Germany or the Netherlands. They end up with a recession, they end up with very small interest rate. This is just not working for anyone.
I'm sure we come back to that, as there are a lot of questions on that already in our Q&A. But I'd like to invite Marion to take over from here first, and then we come to your question, then we can come back to that. Right,
yeah, I'd like to just zoom out for a moment. In your book, you show that moments of crisis, such as the world wars, led to a sharp decrease of inequalities, actually, for a variety of reasons. Do you feel that we're going through such a moment, that you feel that this could be an opportunity to reduce inequalities, because maybe it will open a political space for the ideas that you're promoting?
Well, crises are not enough in themselves to reduce inequality. Crises can lead to all sorts of monsters as well, and in fact, World War I and World War II, as you know, also led to a number of monsters. And so, yeah, I would not bet on that. I think so. Coming back to this current crisis, it can have very different political consequences. On the one hand, it is certainly going to reinforce the legitimacy of a number of public policies, in particular public health. I think the need to invest more in public health facilities, hospitals. That a few years ago in France, the president was saying, there's no money for the hospitals, there's no magic money for hospitals, as he was saying, and suddenly the magic seems to operate, and everybody seems to be thinking that there should be more money for health policy and hospital, at least in the short term. So I think this crisis will certainly reinforce the field that we need strong public services, strong public infrastructure, in particular in the area of health. But on the other hand, this crisis can also lead to a reinforcement of the sort of return to the nation state and to the borders of the nation state. After every epidemic in history, one of the first reactions is to say, okay, let's protect ourselves from strangers, from everybody else. And I can see in France, who is going to be very strong after the crisis, trying to say, okay, it's all about the ideology of open frontier in Europe. Trump is already playing this card. I'm not sure it's going to work, because people have seen him in power, and I don't I'm not sure they want to see him for 4 more years, although, nobody knows at this stage. But in France, for instance, the extreme right so far has never been in power, so people still feel it's novel, and they will play this card of saying, return to the frontier very strongly. There will be regional election in France next year. Remember last regional election, they had 45% of the vote in the 2 regions, the north of France and southeast of France. Are they going to stay there at 45? And they lost only because there was a coalition of everybody else against them. Will there be a coalition of everybody against them this time again? These are big regions. These are regions with 5 or 8 million inhabitants. So okay, that can be one political consequence of the crisis as well. So if we don't build another way to organize internationalism, I am internationalist, I am federalist, I say, but I think we need a different approach to federalism that, the one we've had in Europe so far, which has been very much market federalism, sort of competition of everybody against everybody. And if you look at who approves the European Union, in the Brexit referendum or in the French referendum of 1992, 2005, in pretty much every referendum, you can see that only the top, people with top human capital, top financial capital, who benefit from the mobility, approve it, and all the bottom groups are against it. And at some point, we have to take this warning seriously. I mean, the idea that we just need to better explain what we do, what the European Union is doing, is that everything is going to improve suddenly. I would like this to be true, but I don't think this is realistic. I think if we don't change quite fundamentally the way we organize relation, within Europe and more generally in the way we organize globalization, basically, you cannot have free trade and free circulation of capital without any common taxation, without any common objective to reduce inequality, any common social and verifiable target. And that's, yes, that's something, and when I hear today, the Netherlands, the Dutch government saying, okay, we don't want to share the interest rate of public debt because we don't want to repay the debt of the South, coming from a country that is extracting, close to 10 billion euro per year, according to Gabriel Zucman estimate in corporate tax revenue by doing what they do, gosh, this is very dangerous. This is, we are really playing cards. We know, from a point of view of economic rationality, this estimates I just referred to, are very well founded. There's a lot of work showing that this kind of attitude, to steal basically the tax revenue of the other countries, it's not constructive. If we all do that, then what do we do? It's just not working. And so
specifically on that, if I may, you highlighted just before in this interview how the crisis made inequalities more visible even than before, because some workers are obviously much more affected than others. Do you feel that will put some winds in your sails, if I may say so, and especially on some of your proposals, such as a wealth tax or more transparency or on capitals moving?
Yes, but if we don't change the rule of the game at the European level, again, by building maybe with a smaller group of countries the possibility to implement common tax like this and common investment policy by taking decision with a majority rule. So, for instance, if we, I think we should use, for instance, this French-German assembly to open, of course, to Spain and Italy in order to supervise, a recovery budget based on common bonds and a common wealth tax and corporate. If we were to change the rules of the game so as to have this positive and redistributive way of using Europe and transnational cooperation in order to reduce inequality and to promote a more equitable and sustainable growth model, then I think it could work. But I'm afraid that because of very conservative thinking in Europe. We don't really change. We keep saying, okay, unanimity rule, will work one day. Let's keep with the same, institutions, the same number of countries, because if we break apart, that's going to be even worse. Therefore, let's continue business as usual. I mean, I can see the arguments. They are not completely, meaningless. I mean, I think at the end they are becoming weaker and weaker. And,
I've got a few questions here on exactly that, if I may, just to chime in here. One attendee asks, which countries concretely would join France and Germany in a group of co-countries? Are you talking about Italy and Spain? And is the real rift here on Corona bonds exactly between France and Italy and Spain versus Germany, or is it a bigger picture between North and South?
I think it should, of course, be open to every country. And, the objective is to convince as soon as possible every country from the Eurozone to enter, and of course, also to convince every country outside the Eurozone to enter the Eurozone and to enter this mechanism. But to begin with, we have to start with, whoever is ready to start. So who's ready to start? I think, Spain, Italy, France, probably Portugal, Belgium, Greece. Let's see. If we take as a proportion of the population of the Eurozone, because after all, we're supposed to be in a democracy, well, I think there's already a vast majority. Okay? So I think if we add, majority rule decision making with the Eurozone Assembly, with say members from Parliament in proportion to population, in effect, this is what we would have. And so the only reason why we don't have it, is because we have this veto power by, sometimes very small population. You know better than me. Luxembourg is less than, is it 1%? No, it's more 0.1% of the population of the Eurozone, like 500 million, 500,000. It's more 0.1%. 0.1%. Even the nobility in France in Ancien Regime, it was 1% of the population. So here you have an institutional system with a veto power, for 0.1% of the population, and it simply cannot work. So I think you at this stage, in my view, France should make an explicit proposal for such a mechanism, open to every country, but saying clearly, after a certain date, people who don't want to join, well, we are going to start with whoever is there. So maybe it will be just Italy, Spain, France, Portugal. I don't know who will be there. And then
one man, one vote rule. You think?
Sorry.
It should be one man, one vote in the logics that you just presented. So every citizen, one vote, and a new democratic governance of this whole new thing.
Okay, so that's an interesting question. So we've published this manifesto for the democratization of Europe, which is available on the website tdem.eu, which a little bit over 100,000 people have signed across Europe, which is still even smaller than the population of Luxembourg. So you can see it is small, but it's still something.
Luxembourg.
Yeah, maybe not. We do what we can. But anyway, so in this specific proposal, it's not exactly proportional. Well, basically, we propose to have a European Assembly made up of mostly of national parliament members. When 80% of this European Assembly will be made up of national parliament members, 20% from the European Parliament. Sorry for my friends in the European Parliament. We can talk more about this if you want. But I think it's very important to put national parliaments at the center of European construction. Otherwise, especially as far as taxpayers' money is concerned, I don't think you can make progress without including the Bundestag members and members from the different national parliaments at the forefront. At least this is our analysis. And it will be proportional to the population of each country, but with a minimum number of seats for the smaller countries. So in effect, it will be not exactly proportional, but it will be closer to proportional than the current European Parliament division. This is, look, we don't claim we have the perfect formula, but, remember that, the Karlsruhe Constitutional Court, a number of times said, one of the limitations of, how much decision making you can transfer to European institutions, in particular in terms of budget, is how close you get to, one man, one vote democratic ideal. And it's not an issue only in Germany. It's also an issue in France. It's also an issue in Italy. Once we are talking about, the power to vote over budget and taxation, it's really difficult to say that, individual citizens who are going to pay potentially a common wealth tax or a common income tax in every country, don't have an equal participation in the assembly. So you can have, a little more representation in proportion for smaller countries, but I think we have to be careful. But okay, to simplify, let's say in proportion to the population of, France, Spain, Italy, etc. Yes.
Yeah, you describe at length these policy proposals and just reform proposals in your book. Yet, you have to have like strong voices at the European levels to defend them and implement them. Do you feel currently that some European leaders are making headway in the direction that you're supporting, or who do you feel is closest to your ideas and platform?
If you look at the people who put their signature on our manifesto, you have people from pretty much everywhere, from the extreme left to the center right, to the center, and then there's a question of how motivated you are to go in this direction. If we think of the current French government, who, as claims to be very, pro-European and want to make progress in terms of European integration, and always tries to play, the card of the good cop with Spain and Italy as compared to the bad cop in Germany and the Netherlands. The problem, okay, it's always nice to play the good cop, but the problem is that in terms of common taxation and more generally fiscal justice and economic justice more generally, Macron is in a very weird position because, as he started, one of the main policies he implemented when he became president of France was to get rid of the wealth tax. The following year, he wanted to increase carbon tax. Then people realized that exactly the same amount of money, 5 billion euros basically per year that they were going to pay in extra carbon tax was roughly exactly the same amount of money that was going to get out of the budget in order to pay for the repeal of the wealth tax and the suppression of progressive taxation of dividend and interest. And then people said, okay, is this really for the environment that you're increasing the carbon tax? And is this really the purpose? And, of course, people went crazy, as you know. And the outcome is that, this government, in effect, has destroyed the idea of a carbon tax for a number of years in France. Whereas before that, it was gradually increasing year after year. So, we'll have to come back to it because at some point we know that's part of the solution, but we'll have to come back to it as part of a much more redistributive package, I think. So I think it has to come with more tax justice. And if you want to promote the message of fiscal cooperation and modernization in Europe, you have to be yourself strongly committed to, fiscal justice. And this is where, the pro-European message of Macron, is as a problem in effect, because you cannot say first, there's nothing we can do about tax competition in Europe, and this is why we're going to get rid of the wealth tax, and then say, oh, by the way, it would be nice to have more cooperation. It's just, it just doesn't work. So with the current government, that we have, it's complicated. Now things can change. What I see throughout history in my book is that you have lots of government, who didn't plan to do certain things, and because of crises, have to change their ideology, have to change. So let's see what happened. I want to be positive, and I think the French-German Parliamentary Assembly is a good example. I think it's good that Merkel and Macron did that. I think I would like them to go further and to give more power to this assembly, and in particular more power in terms of common taxation, common budget, and possibly common debt. And maybe they will do that in a couple of weeks or months, depending on how the economic situation evolves.
We don't have a lot of time, so I'll just like to take a moment to take a bit more questions from the audience, especially coming back to the recovery efforts and the EU stimulus money. One person asked Pierre Tardieu, how do we make sure EU stimulus money goes to the right projects and does not deepen inequalities by creating windfall profits? We've seen in recent days government announcing huge aid package for companies such as Air France-KLM or Lufthansa. What did you think of that, and do you think this is a good way to do it?
Well, no, I think we should think more about what kind of sectors we want to invest into, and I think in principle we should use this opportunity to shift our priorities. Well, first, investment in health, investment in education. We've had a huge increase in the total number of students over the past 10 years in France, but also in many countries throughout Europe, which is very good, except that our budget, our investment into the human capital of these students, has not increased, not even as much as the number of students, so that the investment per student has actually declined, which, we claim, we have the, famous Lisbon objective of being, the leader, information economy in the world, whatever. But then what we have over the past 10 years is actually a decline in the investment effort per student. And more generally, we've seen a decline of educational investments, a stagnation in absolute terms since the 1990s, but given the increase of fraction of a generation going to higher education, that's a decline. So I think investing in higher education research is a priority. And then, of course, there's all the issue of more investment in green technologies, in making homes and buildings, better protected with respect to energy dissipation and consumption. And we always talk about that, but we never put the resources that will be necessary. This is far too slow what we are doing in this direction. So we need to take the opportunity, to change, the sectors on which we put the most effort.
So, I mean, concretely, you think we shouldn't put that much money into these companies that I cited? Like, what do you think of the specific, stimulus and recovery efforts of EU countries right now?
Yeah, I don't want to say we necessarily want to take away this money, because I think it will also be a mistake, to believe that we are going to solve global warming simply by hitting, the airplane sector very hard. And, we know it's important, but, it's 3% of global emissions. So, we have to take a global perspective on what we do. And so maybe we are giving too much to these sectors. We have to see at the complete, at the complete map. But, I don't want to say, out of a general principle that there should be no help whatsoever, for the companies in this sector. It would be easy to say, but I don't think this will make a lot of sense.
One more question on efforts toward climate change and investment in green technology. You said about the European Green Deal recently on French radio that it was hot air. C'est du baratin. Can you explain?
Well, I think we are presenting, big numbers all the time, which are in effect, using the same budget several times in several announcements, where we are counting the same money several times. We are counting, the private contribution that we expect will complement our public investment effort, as if it was part of our public budget. We are multiplying the numbers over 10 years or more in order to make them look big. We always, the communication about this, I think is so different from what we really do. Look, there are very simple issues about, are we able to have, common taxation? Are we able to have a common interest rate? And if the answer is no to each of these questions, it really means that we are not, we are not making a lot of progress in the right direction. And so, I think we have to be careful about this communication strategy of trying to make, everything looks huge, even when it's not, because at the end, people will just stop listening. And this is why, the issue of having all this discussion behind closed doors is a major problem. I really want to stress that, the fact that we have started again in recent weeks to have these meetings, finance minister, Eurozone summit, in the middle of the night, announcing in the morning that they have saved the Eurozone for the 11th time or 30th time in 10 years. People are tired with this. The fact that we are starting again with this kind of governance system, make me, I don't know. This is, if you don't see at least what, the exchange that happened between the people who are in charge of making decisions, this system, this will not bring more transparency into this discussion.
I'd like to, we're coming to the end of our time, but there's a flurry of questions in our Q&A here, responding to, or we have actual follow-up questions on what you said before, which I have to summarize a little bit. People want to know actually what would this smaller group of people, of countries issuing joint debt be practically worth? Is that something that we need, as you say, to get out of the current system, or would anybody, James here asked, who would actually buy those pigs that on the global market? And one more question that I'd like to read out. What you are proposing here is essentially a multi-speed Europe on steroids. Is that something that you would, how you would describe your own proposal?
Yeah, multi-speed Europe has been there for forever, and maybe you have noticed that there's one country out of the 28 countries that just left the European Union, a couple of months ago. So, what are we going to wait? Are we going to wait for the 28 countries to become 27, 26, 20, before we ask ourselves? I think at some point, yes, this is multi-speed Europe because it's going to be difficult to have a unanimity decision, to make progress in the direction of common taxation. But my expectation is that even if a smaller number of countries, remember that, Germany, France, Italy, Spain make close to 75% of the population and GDP of Eurozone. And, of course, Eurozone is not the entire European Union, but it is sort of the most integrated part of the European Union. And these 4 countries make 75% of the population. So, I think if these countries move, or at least if, 3 out of 4 of these countries, move, and, ideally 4 out of 4, and, as many as possible right away, I think it will create a movement which, most countries, if not all, will join pretty fast. Let me also say that if we don't do this kind of change, what we're going to have, just like in the past 10 years, is a completely asymmetric balance of power between budgetary decision-making and monetary decision-making. So we are going to have unanimity rule on budgetary side, so very little action. Therefore, the monetary side, so the European Central Bank, which has majority decision-making, will have to do all the work. Now, they can keep doing that. Remember, the size of the ECB balance sheet, has increased from 10% of GDP in 2008 to 40% of GDP today. This is a huge increase, which nobody would have guessed 10 years ago. But this is still much less than, if you look at Japan today, or actually Switzerland for other reasons, they have 100% of GDP on their central bank balance sheet. So, in principle, we could continue like this. And if there is no progress in terms of common budget, common tax system, etc., this is what will happen, because there will be such a strong pressure on the European Central Bank to do something that there will be no other solution. Now, in the long run, I don't think this is good, because in terms of democratic accountability, in terms of democratic transparency, you cannot ask to a board of central bank, to take so much responsibility, but they will have to do something. I think it's going to be very difficult to explain to public opinion in Europe. Okay, we were able to print 30% of GDP to save the financial sector. So this is more than 1 year of GDP of Germany, more than 1.5 years of GDP of France. This is 3% of GDP every year during 10 years, 3 times more than the entire European Union budget. And it's going to be very difficult to explain to the European opinion, okay, now we cannot do anything for the corona crisis, or we can. So when Spain is asking for a perpetual bond, of 10% of GDP to be basically printed by the European Central Bank in order to help the countries that were most hit by the corona crisis. In a way, this is common sense. Public opinion in Europe, how are you going to tell them, okay, we've printed 30% of GDP to save the banks, but we cannot print 10% to save you from corona? The narrative is going to be very weak. So I think, at some point, if we don't want to go into more democratic decision-making on taxation, on budget, then this will be the monetary road entirely. I think money can be part of the solution, but it cannot be the solution on its own. You need more democratic accountability. You need progressive taxation. You need a lot more than a central bank.
Ask one more question from our audience here. We have talked a lot about France and Germany and Southern Europe, basically. But is Mr. Piketty aware? Of course you are, but I'm just reading it out. That we also have EU members in Eastern and Central Europe. What about them?
I'm happy that you asked, because I was very interested, to see last week or 2 weeks ago, the government from Poland saying, okay, maybe we should have, own resources for the EU budget, and we should have a common tax on financial transaction or corporate profits. So of course they are interested in making sure that the regional funds toward Poland will be financed in the future. So that's partly why they are now supporting to have a common taxation at the level of Europe. But still, I think this is a very interesting development and positive development in a way. Because if we end up in a situation where the supposedly anti-European government of Poland asks for a common European tax, whereas the Social Democrats in Sweden don't want to hear about a common European tax or mutualization of interest rate or whatever, I think it's an interesting sort of twist about who is internationalist and who is not internationalist. And so let's see. I'm very concerned. The fact that governments like the government of Sweden, is supporting this very conservative attitude of the Netherlands and Germany on the Eurozone. I find it, in a way, this is a final. Well, maybe not the final, but a very big disappointment with the notion of the social democracy. This sort of inability to move to some form of transnational economic justice and fiscal justice and international project, and having this kind of very nationalist attitude, in effect. Because the attitude of saying, okay, this is all because the South people who are so lazy want to take money from us, this is nationalism. Nationalism is not only among the nationalists. Nationalism is also with a number of so-called centrist politicians, center-right, center-left, who keep saying their public opinion that this is all about stealing their money, whereas it is not. This is about regulating capitalism, regulating the market, having a common interest rate in order to not to put our life, in the end of financial speculation, having a common taxation of big corporation, high wealth holders. This is about reducing inequality within country, not big transfer between countries. Well, when there is a big epidemic shock that hits more some countries, you want to have some transfer. But generally speaking, it's about reducing inequality within country, and I hope so. Let's see. I think, but to return to your question about Eastern Europe, I think it could be that in the kind of proposal I was making about common parliamentary assembly in order to have some common taxation, some countries from Eastern Europe could be more interested than Luxembourg or the Netherlands or Sweden. Let's see.
I think we're running out of time, unfortunately. So I wanted to ask you a last question, maybe a tad bit more personal. In a footnote in your book, you write that you voted yes to 2 referendums held in France about deepening the European project in 1992 and 2005. And no, you describe your past choice as some sort of naively hopeful attitude. I think you wrote posture d'attente béate. What would you tell your younger self? What would you do now?
Well, I mean, my reaction to this naive posture, has been to try to contribute to the redefinition of a better European project, in particular with this manifesto for the democratization of Europe. So my conclusion is not that I'm going to vote no. my conclusion is that I'm going to keep voting yes, but I'm going to fight to change the institution and to try to convince people that there is another kind of federalism. So to summarize, I am federalist, I will remain federalist, but I want to convince people that there is something like social federalism. There were I also, there's a part on the book, I don't know if you've seen it, but there were all these discussion already before World War II, in 1939, 1940, between Beveridge, Hayek, Barbara Wilson, about how to reorganize a European federation after the war. And there was a big fight between Hayek, who wanted sort of market federalism, and Barbara Wilson or Beveridge, who wanted a European federal progressive tax on inheritance or social security system. And we've taken the road of market integration, which for a long time was a very good road. But I think now we have to move on more social federalism. But to summarize, I will have a very hard time voting no, and I think I will keep voting yes, but really try to push for the different kind of European federalism.
Thomas Piketty, thank you very much for being with us for this highly interesting, almost an hour of a conversation. Marion and I thank you very much on our behalf and on Politico's behalf. Thank you very much to all of you who followed this conversation. I'm afraid we didn't get to all of your questions, but I think we got through a lot of them. Have been their own or actually summarized by us. I invite you to give us feedback. You can write your feedback to events@politico.eu, and it is highly welcome. It makes us, helps us to make our events like these even better. And I'd like to announce that this is the first ever virtual Brussels Playbook, but that it will not be the last one. And next week already, we are going to continue this conversation actually with a topical speaker as well. And we're talking about the Eurozone, and maybe we can take this discussion further next week with Irene Tinali, the chairwoman of the Econ Committee in the European Parliament next week here. And I would be pleased to welcome you back, everybody. So thanks again. Have a wonderful afternoon. Again, thank you, Thomas Piketty, Marion, and goodbye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye, everybody. Thank you.